Okay, we're moving now into the initiative horizon, the second of our three horizons, the middle road. As usual, the objectives for this module will be to understand a bit about the horizon and its purpose, look at the elements of this particular horizon, look at how the Agile principles apply to it, and talk some about techniques. And then we're going to try and get to a little bit of a mapping at the end of this on to just take a look at how the initiative, how this particular horizon maps to some of the actual Babok version 3 tasks. So what's an initiative? Well, we've talked a lot about that, so it's kind of at this point a rhetorical question. I mean, initiatives are um, the tactical projects that we take on in order to satisfy our strategic goals. Uh, you could probably talk about an initiative as a project. You could probably talk about it as something that might be a combination of projects. But it is a more um, tactical goal. Okay. So at the initiative horizon, what we're looking for is to make decisions regarding specific solution options, their features, their priorities, and their lifespan. This is starting to get into the area where more traditional BAs are more comfortable. It's the kind of things that we've been tasked with doing over the long haul for making projects more successful. To what extent we do things like prioritization and developing lifespans or basically product roadmaps is up for grabs, but that this is the horizon where this really starts to take shape. And the most interesting thing about this is that we're looking for a solution that minimizes output and maximizes outcome. The goal is how little work can we do to get the best result. I really like that, minimize output and maximize outcome. At this level, we're asking a bunch of different questions, and we're starting to hone into on this. How will our solution satisfy the need? How will we get the maximum output from our solution, and ensure that our solution fits within any constraints that we've identified? What features do we need for a specific project, a specific product, specific initiative? What is the roadmap that we're going to be dealing with for delivering this particular product? Because we're considering not the idea of delivering the product en masse. We're considering the idea of delivering this in a phased model. Is that always the case? No. If you happen to have an environment where you do projects under a predictive model, or if you happen to be doing a project or a number of projects where they're really just small little tweaks to an existing application or an existing process, then you may deliver the entire output of the project in one fell swoop. But if you're looking at bigger initiatives, bigger kinds of things, then if you're going to be operating in an agile environment, you're probably going to be delivering those in phases, some sort of phased approach, and determining what those phases are going to be, when they're going to happen, and what they're going to contain are the things that we want to be answering or looking for at the initiative horizon. Another key here is that we're looking at feedback from the strategy level to inform decisions at the initiative horizon, and feedback from the delivery horizon to inform decisions at the initiative horizon. In particular, this is where we would decide whether we continue to go forward with an initiative, whether we need to change something about an initiative. we may change the roadmap. We may, as a result of something that we've delivered, determine that features that we thought were going to be necessary are not necessary, and so we're going to want to deprioritize those, put them in a place where people can see that we have considered them, but that we have determined that they're not necessary and we're not going to deliver them. We may find things that we initially thought we were not going to need to deliver, that based on what we've done in our initial deliveries, we find that all of a sudden some of those things bubble up to the top, or bubble up just to a point where we say we have to consider this. Those are the kinds of decisions that are made at the initiative horizon. Okay. How does it interact with the strategy horizon? Well, obviously, any initiative that we undertake is intended to satisfy a need that was identified at the strategy horizon. So there's a pretty clear relationship between the two. We should always be able to say this is how this initiative will help us fulfill our strategic objectives, our strategic goals. This is the alignment thing that I'm sure we've all seen over the course of our careers, where sometimes that breaks down and we don't have that alignment, or we're not aware of that alignment, even if it does exist, and that puts our projects at risk. It puts our strategy at risk if we're expending resources that are not contributing to the achievement of strategic goals. It puts those very goals at risk. We've just wasted time, money, and resources. Strategy horizon is intended to communicate to the initiative horizon a solid understanding of the need that is trying to be met by any particular initiative. If we don't understand that need, it can be very difficult for us to determine an appropriate solution. So the strategy horizon communicates to us what that need is, why that need exists, and that we have determined from a strategic viewpoint that it is worth addressing this need. Again, in terms of feedback, this can, this plays back in that we may start to consider initiatives. We may say, in order to achieve this specific goal, these are the things that we have to do. As we delve into the viability of solutions for those initiatives, we may determine that it's just not cost effective for us to do this. So the goal would be, by looking at the possibilities, the solutions at the initiative level, we could inform the strategy level that says, you know what, we need to rethink this because based on our assessments and our investigations, we're not going to achieve value from this. We're going to wind up costing ourselves money, or we're not going to achieve the level of value that was anticipated from the strategic decision. So again, we're feeding information forward and backward, feeding it back to strategy, and we'll be feeding it forward to delivery. The decisions we at this point are looking at specific things that need to be accomplished. We're starting to identify specific products or processes that will help us to achieve this strategic goal. Ideally, we should be investigating multiple solutions. We should always be investigating at least 2 solutions for any particular issue. And the reason that I say that is because one possible option for any particular issue is to do nothing. It's an option that people don't tend to consider, but it is a viable option. It should always be considered. So you should always have at least 2 things that you're considering: an action and inaction. And you may have multiple actions that you're considering. These, at the initiative horizon, this is where these decisions are made. This is where these questions are asked.
Tom, I had a quick question.
Sure.
So as far as we'll seldom find ourselves in a spot where there is no project, that is in progress, and we're just starting. So is it important to identify with multiple things in flight? Is it important to identify which horizon there are, or do we run the risk of being a little waterfally when we do that?
I think we run the risk of being waterfally. I think that each particular initiative, I mean, you may tie a number of initiatives together to achieve a strategic goal. You may need to tie a number of initiatives together because there are dependencies that are identified. But in general, you want to be saying, you want to be allowing each solution to proceed on its own in the environment that you're working with, under the constraints, under the assumptions, in the context of the other initiatives that are going on. But if you start to try and say all of our initiatives should be at this particular point, they're all moving forward lockstep, then you're going into that more waterfally way of doing things. Okay.
Got it.
We've seen these two bullet points already more than once. The initiative horizon is where we determine how to proceed next macro from a macro level. We're now into actions. We're now into taking actions. At the strategy level, we're determining that we need to take action. At the initiative level, we're starting to take actions. Okay. The elements and each of these horizons are broken down into elements. This one, the initiative horizon, it's a good way to look at the horizon. Uh, One of the things that we need to do here is to identify solution options. Uh, we're going to look at possibilities for how can we achieve whatever portion of our strategic goal we're looking at, and I'm thinking of this as this is the horizon where we say who is going to be impacted in our organization, and we want to focus on each of those groups and say how is this particular group going to be impacted by this, how is this particular process going to be impacted by this. And so we want to identify those areas and start to identify potential solutions for that. So we may say for one particular area, we need to build a new tool. That becomes a software kind of thing. For another particular area, we may say, okay, we have the appropriate tools in place, but we need to modify our process. The process needs to be slightly different in order for us to achieve something. That could even go down to particular products where we could say for this particular area, there is, I don't know, maybe we need to rearrange the office, and that may become a project to say in order for this to work, this is what we need to do. In this particular case, it's not building software, it's not changing process, it's moving everybody. Those are different solution options. They're all intended to feed into how we achieve the strategic goal that we're trying to achieve. And we want to identify um, at least, we need at least one. We obviously have the inaction option, which is two. Ideally, you would want to take the time, at least a small amount of time, to say, are there any other possibilities here? Um, you don't want to agonize about this, and in many cases you can't really agonize about it because there's a pressure from some level, some people to start moving. So frequently you're going to be put in a position where the first solution or the most obvious solution is going to be the one that the organization is going to key in on, and that's what you're going to be working with. This is particularly true if BAs and the business analysis function is not engaged early enough in the process. At the initiative horizon is when those kinds of questions should be asked and answered. And if you don't engage your BA forces, your BA function, until that decision has already been made. Then you invite the possibility that perhaps the solution that you're putting forth is not the best or the most efficient one. But that having
And that's the reason why I asked about project management level, because one of the other things that I have noticed is that decisions are made at a higher level that would have been benefited from having an analyst actually work through it. And so at times it seems like the project managers are trying to work like their own business analysts themselves. And
Yep.
some of them in our organization were used to that before the organization actually started hiring on business analysts. They were trying to do their own analysis, but only, having studied or done project management, they
Mm-hmm.
were thrown into it. So that's the reason I asked what I asked, because
Yeah, and it's not uncommon, and the funny thing about it is that it's almost made more dangerous by what PMI has done, where they're recognizing that business analysis is a key function and a key component to the success of projects, and rather than saying, okay, we need to engage the business analysis community and really focus on building a holistic relationship with the BA community, the PM community has started to say, well, all of these people are moving towards agile, and they're saying we don't need no stinking project managers. We're gonna do this on our own, and so the PMs are saying, well, what does that leave for us? Um,
right.
and so now they're morphing into the combination of a PM and a BA.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and it's scary because we have had two project managers who actually saw that early on and started taking that PMI/BA training. And I said, "Oh boy, what does that mean for us? Are they going to get rid of the BAs now?"
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and the funny thing, or the really funny thing about this is, if you look at this from a more holistic picture, really BAs and PMs are dynamically opposing forces. Really, what they're looking at and what their focus is almost diametrically opposed, and what really would work in that environment is to recognize that and say, okay, since we have this push-pull going on between the two of us, the way we're going to accomplish this, the way it's going to work most successfully, is if we get together and work together and understand each other's perspective and respect each other's perspective and deal with it, as opposed to saying, well, we need a BA function in the agile environment that's being recognized more and more, so we don't need no PMs. If we need a PM, well, it's really the product manager and the product owner and the BA and the scrum master. Between the three of them, they'll figure out how to manage the project. And from the project management side, they're saying, well, we need to maintain our relevance. If we need to do business analysis, we've been doing it a lot in the past because we didn't really have a robust BA function. So why do we need to bring business analysts on now? We'll just morph ourselves into being able to be combinations of PMs and BAs.
exactly.
Yep. Yep. Reality strikes. Yeah. The best of them are when the PM and the BA respect, understand, and collaborate and cooperate with each other. That makes life really good on both sides. But here we should be taking the time to investigate more than one solution, or just ask the question that says, is there another possibility here, so that we don't get tunnel visioned into there's only one way to do this, it's this way, because we don't have the time to worry about whether there's any other way. Okay. Here at this horizon, we need to understand what we're trying to do. We need to understand the need. We need to understand what the goal is. And we should be focusing on the idea that we have clear and measurable objectives so that we can answer at the end of the day, were we successful? Can we measure our success? This is the stuff that's handled at this horizon. Okay. Accessing solution options consideration. If we understand what we're trying to do, then we can understand what needs to be done in order to achieve that. More understanding around the objectives and the goals and the measurable outcomes, we can say what will constitute a viable solution here. As I pointed out earlier, we could have projects that involve the creation of software. We could have projects that involve the creation of new processes or revised processes. And we could have projects that are as simple as moving the entire organization to a new home location. So it's a physical project. And all of those need to be assessed to say, if this is our goal, what kinds of things can we do and should we do in order to achieve that goal? At this level, we're also looking at potential risks, types of risks, and how we're going to deal with risks. This is when this comes into play. Constraints in the organization, things that we have to be able to accommodate with our solutions. This is the horizon where all of that's done. Assumptions. Assumptions are a big one. Assumptions are frequently presented as constraints, or at least viewed as constraints. Assumptions are something that we should be constantly monitoring and constantly validating, making sure that we understand if we made a decision, these are the factors that went into the decision. If any of those factors are not have not been verified or validated, then there's a possibility that the decision that we made based on those assumptions is going to be incorrect or could be incorrect. And so we need to be aware of that. We may not be able to do anything about it. Validating assumptions takes time, it takes information, it takes effort. We should make that, but we may not have the information, so we may not be able to come to a conclusion. The one that I'm reminded of, and I may have mentioned this, when they were implementing the Affordable Care Act at the healthcare company that I was working for, we were under the control of the New York State government. And the New York State government was very good at not making decisions. They would tell us, you have to implement this process by the end of the month. Oh, by the way, we haven't decided what that process is. And it drove everybody crazy, and we were just like, at several points in time, we said, we can't sit here and wait for these people. They've told us we have a hard deadline to meet. If we don't start to move soon, we're not going to hit that deadline, and yet we don't have the relevant information in order to move. This was a situation where we had to make assumptions and say we're going to take our best guess based on what they've done in the past and the way they've dealt with other things. We're going to move forward with that as an assumption, understanding that it may be wrong. This is the horizon where those kinds of decisions come up and they need to be made. Recommending solution options, and I like this because it bleeds back into what I've been talking about, where so very often as a BA you're not asked for options, you're just told to do. But at the initiative horizon is where you should be validating your assumptions, looking at the practicality. Can we do this? What is the impact of this going to be on the entire organization, and can we make a decision to basically undertake a specific solution based on its impacts across the organization. It's hard to recommend a solution option when you're only given one option to deal with. But just be aware that it is part of the BA's purview to be looking at multiple solution options and determining what the best of those options are. You wind up asking, frequently wind up asking questions like, why do we have to do it that way? What about? And this is, again, a plus and a minus, because there are lots of organizations and lots of people who don't like being questioned, don't like what abouts, don't like what ifs. They just want go forward. Uh, that's reality. We have to deal with it. The only recommendation that I could make at that is to keep that in the back of your mind and always be willing and able to gently raise those kinds of questions, to be have it in your mind and be aware that it's out there, but you may not have the opportunity to express it. Identifying potential conflicts or risks. Again, this is all about understanding, gathering as much information about these things and about what you're doing as you possibly can, continuing to gather input and feedback from all sorts of areas and all sorts of people, from past projects, from documentation, all of the things that BAs really do. This is where the BA function really starts to show what it does. Try things out. If you can do it, it's wonderful. In many cases, you're probably not going to be able to do it. The key here would be to look at it from the perspective of how much time and effort will I need to expend in order to try this, because there's a possibility that it may not work, and it's, depending on your organization, if you're given the luxury of experimentation and the possibility of failure, that's wonderful. In many organizations, that's not the case, so you have to be very careful about how much time and effort you expend in experimentation. That is actually represented by this second bullet here, to discover just enough information to determine whether or not a selected option is a good choice. Identifying solution components, again, part and parcel of the things that BAs have been doing in any project environment. You're always talking about, what are the capabilities that this solution needs to have? How do I formulate and aggregate and map those capabilities so that my delivery team, the people who have to produce those capabilities, can work on them efficiently and effectively? In the Agile environment, it's obviously an ongoing process. We're constantly looking at things. We're building things in smaller chunks and building one piece of the solution on top of the pieces of the solution that have already been built. So we're always looking at the components that we're building, the components that we've built, and the components that we're considering to build. Prioritizing solution components. Prioritization overall. Certainly in the Agile paradigm, the Agile mindset, prioritization is a very key player. We're always looking to maximize the value that we're producing. The way that we maximize the value that we're producing is by looking at the components that we're producing and determining which of those components are the most valuable at this particular time. That is always under the guise of, there can be constraints, there can be dependencies, something that you may not perceive as adding tangible value to the initiative or to the project, may be something that is foundational, that the entire project can't move forward without, so that no value can be created before this particular aspect is taken care of, even though this aspect in and of itself will not necessarily deliver any value. Most of the time what we hear in terms of prioritizing solution components is tied into backlog refinement. Again, at the initiative level is where we're prioritizing components, we're prioritizing pieces of a solution. We will also see as we get to the delivery horizon that ultimately we're going to be prioritizing stories and tasks. So that the concept is the same. It's applied slightly differently at at the initiative horizon than it is at the delivery horizon. But we want to be looking at things and asking why they're doing them and what value they're going to add to our ultimate solution. So how do we prioritize things? And this is not necessarily how we prioritize things, but it is just to point out that there are different perspectives that we can use for prioritizing our work. We've talked about value, the impact on the overall outcome, and the value is certainly one thing that we want to be considering in terms of assigning priorities, but there are a lot of other things. Cost is a big one. Do we have the budget available right now to do this? How does cost impact on our overall value? Ergo, should we be looking at high cost items and saying, do we really need to do this? Do we really need to do this right now? The current state of the initiative, based on what we've already done and where we are in the organization, we could look at things and say, well, we have to shuffle and change our priorities. Obviously, feedback. If we're getting feedback on the things that we've built and the things that our customers, our clients are using, we're obviously going to use that to basically inform our judgments about what we should do next. Current performance, if we've developed a part of a solution and we determine that we thought we were going to be able to achieve a significant decrease in the time of a process step. As we're doing it, we're looking at the current performance and saying, gee, we thought we were going to be able to, this was going to result in a lot better performance. It turns out the reality, for whatever reason, is that it's not. So we can prioritize our further efforts to say, we need to address this because we're not getting the performance that we want. And constraints and risks. Obviously, we don't want to be doing things that are going to increase our negative risk. So we want to be aware of the negative risks for any decision that we make and say, do we really need to take this on right now, or should we defer this so that we don't incur additional risk? Do we have constraints that have been added to our landscape that mean that we're going to have to reassess what we are going to do and how we're going to do it? I don't know if all of a sudden a regulatory ruling comes down from an external regulatory body that says you must comply with this ruling within a certain period of time. We just delivered the ruling. Well, obviously we need to reassess our priorities to ensure that we meet that constraint. Continually reprioritizing and it's so many people in so many circumstances would like to think that much of this should be one and done kinds of things, that we should make a decision and we should go forward. And the goal here, and certainly the emphasis in an agile environment, is that our decisions are always subject to reasoned reassessment. That is to say, we should not go into, I guess, what you could call analysis paralysis, where we refuse to make a decision because every time we make a decision, somebody comes back immediately and says, what about what if? that needs to be a balanced activity, so that we're aware that our decisions may need to be reassessed, but not that we're constantly trying to second guess ourselves. One of the keys in this would be to be sure that you're very clear about ensuring that people understand when decisions have been made and what those decisions are. I'm going to say the bad word in the agile environment: document those decisions. Document things so that if somebody raises another question, you can say, this is why we made this is the decision we made, this is why we made that decision. If nothing has changed, then we don't need to reassess that decision. If something has changed, we may need to reassess it, but we don't want to rehash the same things that we've hashed over any number of times, particularly because we don't have a common acceptance, a consensus, or a common understanding of the decisions that we've made. Determine if the need is satisfied, and that's where we started with this, that at the initiative horizon is where we should be looking at, do we continue with the initiative that we've undertaken? Do we need to modify the initiative, or have we satisfied our need? We're not going to get any more out of this, and so we should simply say we're done. We're finished. Don't need to move any further forward. That's one of the delights of operating in an agile environment, is that the goal line sort of continually moves, and it can move further down the field, or it can move up the field. So it can be closer, it can be further away. And if we, based on what we've done, determine that we've crossed the goal, we've succeeded. We've done it. This is also important in terms of having measurable goals, something that is more than I'll know it when I see it, or I'll worry about that later. We need to have targets so that we can say, based on what we've done, what we're seeing, we've hit our targets, we're on the way towards hitting our targets, or we're not going to hit our targets. And based on that information, we can make an informed decision as to what to do next. Usually that is the chief driver. I would say it's the product owner, but it's probably the project, the initiative sponsor, more than even the product owner. The product owner, certainly in an agile environment, can inform that decision, is responsible for what goes into achieving that outcome, and can make a valid decision as to whether that outcome has been met. But the ultimate decision in terms of an initiative, in terms of a project, rests with the project sponsor, and so the product owner is beholden to the sponsor, is responsible for informing the sponsor as to where we are in terms of the delivery of value in meeting our needs. Assess the need. Every time we should be assessing the status of our initiatives. Every time we make a move forward, every time we deliver something, we should be assessing, okay, what have we done? What do we need to do? What have we accomplished? What do we need to accomplish? This operates both at a higher level for the overall project or the overall initiative, and also at the lower levels. We should be constantly assessing, in terms of, even when we get to the delivery horizon, the little bits and pieces that we're delivering, we should be able to break them down into measurable kinds of things. So if you're talking about user stories and acceptance criteria, you may have multiple acceptance criteria for a particular user story. We should be able to say, have we met this particular criterion? And we should be constantly assessing that to say, okay, how much more do we have to do in order to determine that we're completed, whether that's a user story, whether that's an epic, or whether that's a project. Ongoing assessment of the viability of the solution based on what we've done and what we've learned. Does this still make sense? Basically, it's combining all of the horizons together, combining the feedback from all of the horizons together to say, are we still on track to achieve ultimately our strategic goal? When the solution doesn't deliver the right value, change the solution. Yep. If we... Oh, Don left. I wonder if Don had a problem. He said he was having some weather, so I'm hoping that it's just that he's having to reconnect. But the idea here is we're constantly looking at things. Yep, he's back. Yeah, we're constantly looking at things, and if we determine that we're not getting where we want to go, we're not getting what we decided that we were supposed to be getting, then we change what we're doing. We can shift priorities, we can shift components, we can add components. This is a significant part of the whole agile environment is understanding that things change. And as things change, we need to change. Our initiatives need to change. This always needs to be based on solid information. It needs to be considered, but the possibility is always there, and we need to be ready for it. And that's one of the things that the Agile paradigm seeks to implement across our organizations, is that we are nimble and flexible enough to move, to make changes when they need to be changed, when things need to change. The time frame for the initiative horizon is generally, clearly it's smaller than or tighter than the time frame for a strategic decision. It's generally in terms of months. It's in terms of blocks of functionality that can be delivered. You may have an initiative that will go for a long period of time. It remains an initiative. We should still be looking at it. As long as it's a single kind of thing, it would be looked at as a single initiative, but it could extend for a long time. The contract that I worked on for the last couple of years in Denmark actually was one project, and the project had a timeline that was about 3 years. It was a huge project. It was considered a single initiative, but there were lots of different pieces to it, lots of different components to it. It was a big thing, but it was still a single initiative, and as such, we were looking at the timelines for longer period of times. In general, they tend to be shorter. In more agile environments, you're probably going to see that an initiative a couple of months or a couple of months rolling forward would be what we would want to be looking at. Even if it's a large multi-year initiative, we should be breaking that down into smaller chunks and saying, let's look at the next 3 months, let's look at the next 6 months, let's look at the next year. They're all different time frames for dealing at the initiative level. Key issues in the initiative horizon. What are we doing right now? What will we be doing next? What will we be looking for in the future? And we combine all of these things together to build a roadmap for our solution. This is that product roadmap driven down a little bit further with a little bit more detail to it. It's still about we're determining how we're going to deliver value in a shorter time frame than the strategic horizon. Feedback from delivery. Feedback from delivery is going to be very key for the initiative horizon. So we're gonna be determining whether our solution is still appropriate based on what we've done, what we've produced, whether the things that we're working on are still appropriate, and whether we have the appropriate sequence and prioritization of the smaller pieces that we're going to be working on in the delivery horizon. It's interesting that it says that every solution component needs to be delivered to realize the desired outcome. That's a question to my mind. I think we should always be looking at it and saying, will every solution component need to be delivered in order for us to realize the desired outcome? And the idea here, and this probably applies even more to the delivery horizon than it does to the initiative horizon, that by breaking things down into smaller chunks and continuing to deliver those chunks to the people that need to use them, and what just happened? Did you guys lose me? Am I still with you?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, you're still with us, but there
Okay.
was like a blip.
Yeah, my machine just beeped at me and it didn't put anything up on the screen, so I was like, oh no, what happened now? Nothing there. We're still there. Okay, so as I said, this is generating feedback. As we deliver things, we constantly want to be assessing those things. So if we're delivering at the delivery horizon, we're delivering really small pieces of functionality. We want to verify and validate that those work and that those are going to add value. At the initiative horizon, this is where we're aggregating those little chunks together as they need to be aggregated to say, okay, now we can deliver a piece of functionality, a holistic piece of functionality, as opposed to the bits and pieces that go into that functionality. And got a comment coming?
Yeah. So Tom, I was going to ask, it seems like, does it make sense to have roadmaps for basically each of these horizons that are in the level of detail? Like, for example, like in the strategy horizon, kind of a real high level roadmap. Yep. And then as we're into delivery, a more fine-tuned roadmap, probably maybe for the development team and not so much for the C-level people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This is, it's making it visible to the people that need to know it. So your delivery team, who is going to be focusing, doing the nuts and bolts work at the coding level, really wants to know, what am I looking for? What am I looking for next? What's going to be coming up next? What's further on down the line, so that they can focus themselves and say, I have to be working on the code that I'm working on right now, but I know that this is coming up right behind it. So in my copious amounts of spare time, I can say, yeah, this is, if I have any thoughts or if anything occurs to me about what's coming down the pipe, I can weigh in on that. Or if I see something that is way, way, way down the pipe, I know I can tell myself, you know what, don't worry about that. It's so far down the horizon that it's not something I should be concerning myself with right now. So having these roadmaps makes a lot of sense at every horizon, in the same way that having a Kanban board at the sprint level makes sense, so that people can see these are the items that are lined up to be delivered in the next couple of weeks, because we're working on a couple of week time box for our iteration. These are the things that are on the calendar to be delivered. These are the things that I'm working on, and these are the things that I've finished, or that we as a team have finished. And that visibility is valuable to everybody. The key to that is going to be to find the tools and the processes that don't add inordinate amounts of overhead in order to achieve that. And if it's done in an orderly fashion, you should be able to manage that pretty well. And from the initiative horizon to the strategy horizon, obviously we're feeding back what we've done and what the results and what the outcomes have been, so that at the strategic horizon somebody can look at it and say, are we on track to meet our strategic goals? The principles of agile business analysis, um, and some of this is going to be just reinforcing and going, you know, looking at it from a slightly different perspective. You want to review these things. Um, this is an area where you probably want to spend some time studying, in addition to just the definitional kinds of things. So understanding the specific definitions here, because these principles apply to each of the horizons, it's worth a little bit of extra time to make sure that you see that very clearly. See that there are slight differences in the way the principles apply at the different horizons, because you may get asked about that. That may appear on the exam, where they'll ask you about a principle, or they'll give you a circumstance and ask you which of the principles are being applied at that particular point in time. So seeing the whole, at the initiative horizon, you want to be sensitive to inputs from the strategy horizon and from the delivery horizon. You want to be keeping the detail in the context of an overall thing. So you need to be aware of the entire product backlog of all of the epics that are out there, and have a sense of which have been dealt with, which are being dealt with, and which are going to be dealt with. And obviously, looking at it holistically, saying what have we delivered and how does that impact on on what we have to do and what remaining work that we have. Thinking as a customer, obviously, here is where it's a little bit easier to see. Thinking as a customer, customers tend to think in terms of capabilities. They don't necessarily think in terms of details. This is the area where it's important to say, will I be able to do my job with the product that you're delivering? Will this product help me to do my job? Or will this change help me to do my job? Again, I'm going into a solution that might be a change in the process. Will the change in the process help me to be able to do my job better? Whatever solution we choose to deliver, this is where that concern really is really critical, where we need to make sure that we're delivering value to the customers. Again, we want to be looking for feedback from the customers. So this is just giving them something to work work with, and saying, is this being helpful? Is this doing what you need it to do? Analyze to determine what is valuable. Here we're relying on feedback. We're relying on understanding what we're trying to achieve, what the outcomes we're trying to get, and looking at the things that we're doing and the things that we're delivering, and saying, is this going to add value to our solution? It's always a viable question. Get real using examples. Once again, this is about assessing what the current state is, assessing the current reality, not what we would like, not what we think, but what is, and using what is as a basis for making our determinations. Not I think we're gonna do better by doing this, but are we doing better because of what we did? Here, an interesting point here is looking at things from the perspective of what are the most common, the most prevalent circumstances that are going to be addressed by our solution. There is always a tendency to ignore the 80% and focus on the 20%, because the 20% is where most of the pain is. those outliers that have not been addressed by a particular solution, it's a danger to do that. We need to make sure that we get the 80%, that the things that people do on a regular basis, that they have to do on a regular basis, are being done in the most effective and efficient way possible. And questioning when somebody says, but what about this? Asking the question, well, how often does this happen, and how painful is this when it happens? What are the risks associated with this happening? If it's never going to happen, or if it happens once every several months, is it worth spending time on it? It's annoying, and it's really critical when it happens, but if the risk of it happening is very small, we're better advised to focus on things that are going to impact on more people and make our processes overall more efficient for everyone in general. Understanding what's doable, again here looking at the capabilities of our delivery team, the capabilities of our organization, the ability of our organization to adapt and adopt. You can build the greatest solution in the world, and if nobody uses it, it's not doing anybody any good. If it's the kind of environment where people are hardwired into, I do things the way I do things because that's the way I do things, then that needs to be addressed as a part of your initiative, understanding that this is going to be an impediment to implementing my solution, and I need to be aware of that. I can't just say, I'm going to put it out there and they'll use it because that's what they should be doing. So, we constantly want to be looking at that and saying, what are we doing here? What can we do? Collaboration and continuous improvement, obviously, this is part and parcel again of the whole agile environment, the agile mindset, that we should always be looking to work together, that this is a team effort. We don't rise and fall on how well I do my job. We rise and fall on how well everybody on the team collaborates and cooperates to get the job done. Continuous improvement, we should always be assessing what we're doing and asking this at this level. We're looking more at the team level. We're looking at, are we continuing to deliver value? Is our workflow, is our stream delivering value to the people we're working for and working with? This is one of the things about developing a good agile environment, is the ability for your customers to rely on you to deliver on a regular basis. So we need to be mindful of that and say, are we continuing to deliver? Are we satisfying their needs on a regular basis? When we look at all of this, overall, we're looking to see whether we're finished. Have we done what we need to do in order to achieve the outcome that we set out to achieve, or to achieve enough of that outcome to make it not advisable to continue forward? And in the Agile environment, in many flavors of Agile, they include a technique, a retrospectives technique. In the waterfall environment, this was always lessons learned. In most of the environments that I operated in, it was lessons exposed. The idea is to ask ourselves the questions, ask ourselves how we could improve, how we could be better. Obviously, the danger here, and I would be surprised if anyone here has not experienced this, that the way that gets interpreted, that it frequently gets interpreted completely incorrectly, is which finger do we point in which direction? This is something that, as if you're going to be successful in...
Definitely seen that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely seen that.
Yep. And if you're going to be successful in an agile environment, because it relies so much on change, and because it relies so much on asking questions and answering those questions honestly, and in trusting each other, trusting the organization that you work with and the people that you work with and work for, you know, this is a key. If you can't get these things on the table and you can't discuss them in a positive way, you're not going to have a successful agile environment. It's just not going to work. It's going to be a constant blame game, and then you're going to get into the people arguing over, who's responsible for what and who didn't do what, and you just in an agile environment don't have time for that. You really have to be.
And it seems, from what I've seen in the past, unfortunately, it has always seemed that the finger would be pointed back to the BA because everything starts with the requirements, right?
Well, yeah, but if nobody reads the requirements,
Exactly. You don't know how many times I wanted to do what in the olden days was called a walkthrough with the developers, so that they could tell me, did we gather all the stuff you need to do this? Are there any questions you have? There's been times where they say, yeah, I read through the requirements. We don't have to do this on a call, or we don't have to do this, in an office or
Yep.
And I'm like, okay, all right, later on, don't point the finger at me because I tried to get you to look at them.
Yep. Yeah, and this is, one of the things about functioning in an agile environment is the whole idea of continuous collaboration, so that it's not just that the BA is producing the requirements, it's that the BA is producing the requirements in conjunction with the stakeholders and in conjunction with the development team, so that everybody is involved and vested in it, and everybody understands that the stakeholders are going to expect things to be done certain ways. The development team is responsible for delivering to them, and the development team is going to be sitting in the room with the stakeholders looking at this when the stakeholders say, well, no, that's not what it was, so that it's not the developers pointing their fingers at the BA and saying you didn't get the requirements right. It's, we were in a room and we decided this, and this is not what you did.
Right. Yes, indeed.
So retrospectives, important, an important part of it.
I have a
Question?
As a BA should, yeah. So we are talking that, okay, it should be in collaboration with the developer and the stakeholder. So as a BA, should we invite a developer also from a team for getting the requirements or while getting the requirements?
You can. It depends on your developers. It really, it is the kind of thing where it's good to have their input, certainly getting their input as early as possible so that it's not, okay, the requirements are finished, now go forth and build. They need to be aware that they have input, they can have input, they can make their ideas and their thoughts known. It's expected that the team is going to work together, that this is getting the requirements is a team effort. It's not okay, well, the BA does this or the BA does this with the stakeholders and we all sit in the corner and wait for them to get their job done.
There's a level of practice. There's a level of knowledge too. Is that Rahib that's talking? There's a level of knowledge that the developers have about what's to be implemented from those requirements. Mm-hmm. That sometimes we as BAs, like I have some coding behind me, so I have a little bit of a higher level than our other BAs because they've never done any coding at all. But when you don't have that, you really do need to talk to the developers and get their input on, hey, is this clear enough to you? Is it going to be something that later on down the line you're going to say, oh wait, we didn't have a chance to think this through, and now it's going to be a showstopper. So it's
yeah. Yeah, and there's,
Okay.
I've seen and heard situations where people have said, well, you shouldn't have your developers in the room when you're discussing requirements with your stakeholders. I think that the sticking point there is if you can manage and control and facilitate your session well enough so that people understand that the goal of a requirements elicitation session with a group of stakeholders is to understand what they need. How it's going to be delivered by the development team is something that you really have to make sure that the developers don't jump all over it and say, well, this is how we can do this, because there's a real tendency, and it's not only from the developers, it comes from BAs and it comes from some stakeholders, where they immediately want to jump to the how is this going to be done instead of focusing on what do we need to do, why do we need to do this, um, you know, what value is this going to add? So it it depends on your developers, it depends on your stakeholders, your business stakeholders, and it depends on your capabilities as a BA as to whether how much collaboration there needs to be at what point in time. Ultimately, however, when the developers are actually doing their work, there needs to be clear and clean collaboration with both the people who are the quality people, the testers who are testing the quality of the code, and the business people who have to use it. So that ultimately the goal is that what is delivered by the developers is a product that the business users can use to achieve their goal.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that, in I don't know if everyone's had this experience, but we've definitely found that problematic to have the stakeholders, business stakeholders with the development team members. What we have done though is tried to maintain at least a feedback loop, and whatever needs we are gathering on a really high level and really understanding the needs journey of the user. As long as we can document that and kind of come up with a narrative for the development team, we've found that we're not necessarily having to be that prescriptive technically, but we are thoroughly describing the business need, and that was more helpful. And we did that, in backlog grooming sessions or technical review, whatever you call it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good. Great. Avoid waste.
Thank you.
Yep. Chantal, are we okay? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I was saying thank you.
Okay. Avoiding waste, and this is all about constantly asking ourselves what good is what we're doing. Um, if we constantly get information, we make informed decisions based on accurate information. We don't risk making bad decisions because we don't have a good information. We don't risk making bad decisions because we don't understand what we're capable of. We don't understand where we are. So having that good sources of information puts us in a position where we basically are going to be avoiding wasteful activities. This is again, at this horizon, looking at the things that we're doing, looking at the capabilities, saying, okay, do we need these capabilities? Will these capabilities add value? Uh, you know, those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking at this particular horizon. And key to that, obviously, is that we all understand what we're trying to get to, what the outcome is, so that we can be constantly monitoring that and saying, is this helping us to achieve our outcome? Okay. So, moving on to some techniques for the initiative horizon. We've got a bunch of them here. Some of them, a couple of them are things that we've already done. They'll just be reiterated, so we'll probably skip over them. Kano analysis. Anybody familiar with Kano analysis? I'm going to end my show so that I can jump into...
Nope.
No, I've never heard of this one.
Cool. Kano analysis is actually something that I really like, so I'm probably going to spend too much time talking about it. There's a theory that when you're putting together a product, when you're developing a product and you're looking at the capabilities of a product, there are elements of the product that are absolutely necessary, that without those elements, no one will use the product. Okay. There are elements of the product that are expected, and based on how well you implement those elements, will determine how well your product is received in the marketplace. And it's sort of almost a linear. You'll see in the Kano diagram that it's a linear correlation, and there are elements of the product that are going to be things that people would never have expected, would never have thought of, that are going to, basically, it's the wow factor. It's, wow, I never thought you could do this. I never thought this could happen. Wow. Okay. And basically what Kano analysis does is it says that when you're composing a product mix, or when you're composing a feature mix for a product, you want to be sure that all of those initial things that nobody will accept the product without are there. You want to measure how much effort you put into those things that are going to be on that linear progression of, the better we do this, the more likely people are going to be to appreciate this product. And you always want to try to include a couple of the wow factors. So in a very practical way of thinking about this, think back to okay, let's talk about cars in the way back when. A car, when cars were first put out there, if a car didn't have an engine or a steering wheel or a set of wheels, would anybody buy the car? Probably not. Unlikely that they would. These are key things about building a car that you really need to have in order for it to be a viable product. Okay. So those would be the things that are necessary to the product. Now, as we put an engine in the car. Well, how efficient is our engine? Does it get 1 mile to the gallon? Does it get 10 miles to the gallon? Does it get 100 miles to the gallon? There is a certain customer base that will use that as a measuring stick to say, you know what? The more mileage, the more gas mileage I can get out of my car, the more efficient my car is, the more I'm going to like it. Now, there's another customer base that will say, okay, the faster my car accelerates, the more likely I am to buy it because I really like high performance cars. But it's still this kind of almost a linear progression of if it's really badly implemented, if my car doesn't, if it takes it 3 blocks to get going 20 miles an hour, I'm probably not going to be happy. If it goes 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, I'm probably going to be pretty happy with it. And then there are the wow factors. And looking back at this from a historical perspective, when I started driving a car, there were no such thing as power steering or power brakes. It was all manual. And if you wanted to stop the car, you jammed on the brake pedal and hoped to God that it stopped. So when you tried to park the car, if you weren't careful about allowing it to be moving a little bit so that the wheels would turn, you struggled. And nobody had ever thought of things like power brakes or power steering, so that the first time we saw cars that had power steering and power brakes in it, it was like, wow, you mean I've been struggling all these years stomping on a brake pedal and I didn't really have to? This is great. That's the way Kano analysis works. So you're looking at developing a product that way. And
Well, that's exactly what I've been feeling for the last 4 years as a BA.
yeah, and this is what the Kano analysis graph looks like. It's again a quadrant kind of thing, where your vertical axis is customer satisfaction and your horizontal axis is the degree of achievement. So you'll notice threshold, and you assume that this center line here, the degree of achievement, is a 0 point. So you're assuming that, for your threshold attributes, your engine, your wheels, your steering wheel, etc., it's never going to be higher than 0. No matter how well you achieve them, it's always going to be, if you don't have them, you're basically screwed. You just are not going to go anywhere. Those performance attributes, like I said, it's kind of a linear progression. You see the diagonal line going upward. So this is where your gas mileage might fit, your acceleration might fit. And then your wow factors are all the little extras. Now you would be talking, and it's even, it's having onboard GPS and onboard Wi-Fi, those kinds of things. Onboard, an onboard Wi-Fi connection so that you can have streaming movies in the back seat for your kids. Well, 10 years ago, nobody would have thought of that. That would have been an impossibility. Now it's getting to the point where things like that, or backup cameras, watching, cars that park themselves. All of these things are starting to happen. They were wow factors. They are the orange curve. And the interesting thing about Kano analysis is that things proceed in a vertical direction. So that something that was on the orange curve gradually will migrate down to the blue curve, and then ultimately will wind up at some point down in the bottom curve, so that people would not even think about it. They would just expect it to be there. That's the way Kano analysis works. Okay, and it's an interesting way of looking at products. Yeah.
Sorry about that. It seems like, would you explain why the arrow, the one going towards customer satisfaction, seems to be curving? It seems like, is there something to be noted there?
Both of the upper line and the bottom lines are basically they're exponentials. It's like, if it's something that is not even if it's an unexpected factor, if it's something that's not implemented terribly well, people will be surprised and amused by it, but they won't immediately leap on it. Whereas you implement these things better, it becomes more of an excitement factor, more of a wow.
It seems like that wow factor starts to taper off. Is that true, or?
I think the wow factor goes in the other direction. The more, you may not be able to, because you're looking at things that, when you're doing innovative kinds of things, the likelihood that you can implement something that's innovative extremely well, extremely holistically, so that I don't know. I'm thinking, kinds of things like, maybe you may be able to implement a GPS system in your car, but right now you're probably not going to be able to implement a GPS system that will actually drive your car for you.
I see, because so you're saying the customer satisfaction is it's really your degree of achievement that's your limiting factor there. I got it.
Yeah, I think so. In the wow factors, it's the degree of achievement, and as you move that further forward, as your degree of achievement goes better, it's going to start to drop from a wow factor to basically that linear performance attributes, so that everybody will expect it. You'll expect to have GPS. You'll expect to have Wi-Fi capability in your car. I'm not sure even where that's going to go. Obviously it's going to go into self-driving cars at some point. That's going to be a component, so that you could plug in a route and just say to your car, okay, take me there, and it will take you there. We're not there yet. We're certainly proceeding in that direction. But those kinds of things, I mean, the first time I heard of a car that would park itself, I was like, this is crazy. I mean, can't people park their cars anymore? Yeah, well, there are a certain number of people who can't park their cars, and so for them, having a car that will actually back itself into a parking space and parallel park is pretty amazing. Uh, at some point, it's going to come down to that there are more and more people who don't know how to park their cars, and so they're going to expect that the cars will park themselves. Things like the mirrors that see if anybody's in your blind spot, or the rear facing cameras that allow you to sit there looking at your screen and back up your car because it will tell you what's behind you. The alarms that say when you're too close to something at the front or the back. Self-braking cars. All of those kinds of things are things that you know people were not thinking of, or certainly not thinking about implementing a number of years ago, and slowly but surely it's going to be that every car is going to come equipped with all of these things because they'll basically be commoditized. So that's Kano analysis. I think Kano analysis was kind of fun when I hit that one. Personas. Anybody aware of and dealing with personas in your environments?
Yep.
Yep. Do you find them valuable?
Nope. Nope.
You don't find them valuable.
Not aware of dealing with personas other than that I want people to be androids.
Yeah, I agree. Like the last 3 projects I've worked on, the IT director was like, we need to have personas. And I'm like, well, there's really only 2, either the buyer, in the framework of a buyer, or in the framework of the user.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, and I'm like, I mean, okay, we can, split hairs and split the hairs of the hairs, but I've just found that the personas, maybe they tell a better story, but at the end of the day, when you hand it off to the development team, those guys don't care,
Yeah,
So-
they don't really care, but personas are the kind of thing where you can start to look at from the perspective of how well are we achieving our value. One of the ways that I saw this implemented actually was splitting a customer base. Looking at it, and I think the actual example was something like it was a high-end jewelry service where they were building customized jewelry for people. And what they did was they split their customer base into 3 different segments. They just chose 3, and they talked about it from the perspective of who are the buyers and under what circumstances will they be buying things. So it was, one customer segment was the people who were getting an anniversary present for their wife or husband, who wouldn't do this all the time, but this was a really special occasion for them, and so they were not people who were used to this particular service, but who might be attracted to this service. And would have a certain way of looking at it, as opposed to, and I don't remember what the third one was, but the other one of the other ones was the people who have large amounts of disposable income and who do this because they want to and because they can. And thinking about that, those 2 customer groups have different expectations for how that service is going to function. So by building, by building these specific personas, they could say, okay, yeah, we want to focus on, because we think we've done our marketing, and we've determined that 60% of our market is going to be those people with large amounts of disposable income. So when we're designing our process and designing our service, we are going to focus right now for our initial hit on that 60% that's out there and has a lot of money to spend and is willing to spend it. We understand that there's maybe 10% that are in that, these are the special occasion buyers, and we need to be sensitive to those buyers, but we don't need to design our process and design the whole thing based around that particular persona.
So can I ask, how does the persona equate to the actors in a user story, if it does at all?
It can. There are, talking about to take this to a more general kind of thing. I don't know that it's really practical to speak of this, but I could say I've seen a lot of examples of building ATMs. That's a big that's a big model in business analysis, is the ATM, because everybody assumes they know ATMs and interacting with an ATM. So you would have um, you know you would have certain core functions of the ATM that are going to have to be accomplished by anyone who wants to interact with the ATM, but based on the type of user that they are, it might be slightly different. So what I'm thinking is, you may have a customer who has a bank card that they have to put into the ATM in order to do transactions on the ATM. You may have a bank officer who can log into the ATM remotely to see what's going on. Interacts with the ATM, has to be able to interact with the ATM, has to be able to connect to the ATM, but their connection is different from the user that puts in the bank card. You may have a maintenance person who is responsible for dealing with the ATM from a practical standpoint, also has to be able to get to the ATM, but is physically connecting to the back end of the ATM. So they are each connecting to the ATM. They each have to be able to make a connection to the ATM, but the way they do that is slightly differently. So you might have, it might be a different use case, but it might be the same. It might be basically the same use case with a different persona. It might be, just looking on the customer side. It may be that you have your ATM can be used by your bank customers. They have different capabilities versus somebody who is coming in from an external network, as just because banks have interrelationships where you can use other banks' ATMs to get money. The process of getting money is effectively the same, but the underlying whole thing is completely different, because you're talking about a customer who has an account at the bank versus a customer whose bank has a relationship with the bank. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So and again, this is the kind of thing where, does it make sense? I don't know. If it makes sense for you in your environment, it's a possibility. Do you have access to your stakeholders? Do you have consistent access to your stakeholders, or are you in an environment where your stakeholders are not available, so it behooves you to extract as much information about your stakeholders and how they're going to interact with your product, and have that information available on some level or another to the BA and to the development teams, so that they can think about it from that perspective and say, okay, now I'm talking about a customer. I'm talking about customers who are going to be doing this every day versus a different type of customer who is going to be coming at this system once every several weeks or every several months. And how do I have to implement this so that the person who accesses this system every day, many hours a day, isn't bored by the system, versus the customer coming in once every couple of months not being confused by the system. The way that system is implemented can have an extreme impact on those different customers, and can determine, I'm thinking particularly if the person who comes in every 3 months happens to be the CEO, then you damn well better be sure that the CEO is not going to get annoyed or feel like you're painting him out to be an idiot by your system. That's not going to be a happy circumstance. So you need to be thinking about that, and your development people and your entire team needs to be able to think about it from that perspective. Okay? That's the idea of personas. How much detail you put into it, again, what works in your environment. It may just be that you just need the names of the roles. They become actors. You don't have to go into an in-depth kind of thing, but it may be, if it's going to add value to your conversations, make them more reasonable for people, then put the detail in. If not, don't put the detail in. There in general tends to be a short form and a long form of the personas, so that you may only have a certain number of characteristics versus having an in-depth analysis of that persona. Again, how much you do depends. They talk about the long template and the short template, where you just have, a couple of different pieces of information versus some more in-depth kind of thing. They say you should have a name and an image. Nice to do. You may or may not. It depends. It depends on what's going to work. Again, with all of this, you don't want to be generating work for the purpose of generating work. You want to say, is this going to help? If it's not going to help, don't work with it. But Don, I would say, look at it a little closer to say there may not be two different actors. There may be different shades of gray in that. And then you just need to make an assessment as to whether that's worthwhile to deal with. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah, and if I could make a small comment here for our company, at least, this is a crucial exercise, because what we do is we service small, basically leases under $5,000. And so we have several different users. We have a customer, we have a dealer that basically processes the lease and gives the merchandise to the customer. Then we have the customer service rep, and then the dealer service rep, and then an admin that, so they have varying needs, and identifying their needs has really helped us, improve the user experience. And not just in a kind of, hey, people are happier. There are actual scores. I believe it's called an NPS score, which is user experience or customer satisfaction scores. We can measurably say, hey, we have improved that. So these are real things that make you make money.
Yep. And I would argue, even in your environment, you may have different types of customers, because you're operating in an environment that is probably not homogeneous.
Exactly.
You may want to look at, we have customers, they're all small things, but one set of customers may have, a company that has 10 employees, and another one may have, 100 employees or 1,000 employees, and I don't know what all you're doing, but you need to be sensitive to that idea of how does this impact the individual customers that are dealing with our organization.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And just one of the things that worked really well for our product team was we sat out there, picked a persona, and tried to be as detailed as possible, and went through a needs journey where we just said, I need to be able to do this, and we just went there and listed out all the things that I need to be able to do as this particular user. Yep. And it was enlightening, so enlightening.
Yeah, and this is what drives your design features. It's like, well, okay, this particular type of customer, and it would be helpful if you had access to those particular types of customers so that you could work with them directly. That's an ideal circumstance. But, to extract it down to a persona where you can say, I can sit here and I can try and put myself into that person's shoes and do what they need to do is incredibly valuable. So, planning workshops we've already talked about. Purpose alignment we've already talked about. Real options we've talked about. Relative estimation. Oops, we went to the wrong place. So, relative estimation. How are you guys on relative estimation? How do you find that? Does it operate? Do you do it? Are you good at it? What kinds of problems do you have? The idea here is to be able to look at a work that we have to do and come to some sort of agreement as to what that work is going to take to do. In comparison to either to work that we've done previously or to other work that we have to do. It's a key consideration for Agile.
There's an interesting, I'm going to say, dichotomy in regard to this particular aspect of projects I see. And that is that you have, I'm going to call them factions. You have one faction that says, I'm going to do this relative estimation, but I'm going to make sure that the relative estimation includes time for me to, yeah, time for me to, just in case, just for those just in case kind of situations, which project managers typically do anyway. They do some padding. And then you have the other side where they think they know how much it should take, even though they don't know the actual work that needs to be done. And so it's been a source of contention for me as a BA, and especially since I've been at the very early stages of the bid process, the RFPs, and seeing how no matter what you provide, even though it is honestly realistic, is slashed, as I said before, for the purposes of winning the bid.
Okay, one of the key things that I want to point out here is that in the agile framework, the agile environment, what we're talking about here is not estimation per se, but relative estimation. The goal is to figure out how this compares to other things, either other things that we've done or other things that we have to do. So,
and you say that, and it still is the same thing to me.
Well, it's really not, and that's where so many agile teams get themselves into difficulty. And it's not agile teams getting themselves into difficulty; it's the people that work with agile teams getting themselves into difficulty. The couple of techniques that have been put forth in this relative estimation, clearly you've probably all heard of planning poker as a way to do sprint.
Yeah.
Okay, am I having problems? Because yeah, damn it.
No, you're not having problems. I was just agreeing.
Oh, okay. I got a blurb from GoToMeeting saying there might be network problems, so I was concerned whether.
Oh, you sound good with me, Tom.
Okay, great. We'll keep going. So everybody that's seen or heard anything about Agile has probably heard of planning poker, where you get together and try and estimate your stories, and it's usually done at the sprint level, so that you're talking about user stories, and there's that, and then there's the single line kind of estimation. And the key here is that what we're trying to do is not to determine how long a particular item or how much effort will take for a particular item to be delivered. Is what we're trying to do is to say, how will that compare to the other things that we're working on or the other things that we've worked on? It's all about, is this bigger? Is this bigger than a bread box, or is this smaller than a loaf of bread? That's all we want to get to. We want to be able to kind of line things up and say, okay, we've got all of these pieces that we're going to work on, and all of these pieces are smaller than a loaf of bread. So no matter which one we choose to do at any particular point in time, we can say, with a certain degree of reasonability, that it will take us, somewhere around. I mean, we can deal with our ability to deliver. We can bucket it and say it will be about this long relative to the other things that we're doing. And the real danger with that is that people very often try to drive this down into deadlines, try to drive this down into, allocations of time and money and resources, when that's not really the purpose of the exercise. The purpose of the exercise is to try and get things into some sort of arrangement so that we understand at a very high level what we're looking at. Okay. Interestingly enough, Ingrid, when you were talking about that slashing estimates, there was something, and I'm gonna lose the name on it, but it was they talk about you talk about critical path. okay, project management frequently wants to define a critical path and measure that through, through the whole project and determine the length of the project based on the critical path, the estimates of time and effort and materials to achieve the items in the critical path. And there was a theory put forth, and it was called the critical chain. And what they did was they said, take the critical path and cut the critical path in half in terms of the amount of time and effort that you're going to put forth, and start from that as a premise and see where you go, and then add additional resources on, as you need them, but not try and put this whole path together and go from start to finish. Sort of kind of an agile thing to do. Understanding that people, when they're trying to do predictive planning, they're always going to be padding things. They're always going to be putting things on. And what this critical chain did was to say, okay, take your critical path, cut it in half, and then say there's a bucket that's out there that is called the contingency, so that your overall project time is made up of your critical chain, which is your minimal amount of time to do things, plus however much of your contingency bucket you use. But you don't assign a contingency to each particular item in the chain. You start by saying, this is what this will take to do. And then you have that little bucket at the end in case something happens. Different way of looking at things, and a way of kind of trying to get people more towards reality. But there's a whole book about that. I think the book is called The Critical Chain or something like that. I think if you Google critical chain, it will probably come up, and you'll be able to see it. But relative estimation, the idea is to put a bunch of things on the table and say, okay, which one of these things do we believe is the biggest, the hardest, the most complex? And we put that over to the right-hand side of the table. And which of these items do we feel is the smallest, the easiest, the fastest thing to do? And we put that over to the left-hand side of the table. And then we kind of arrange things along that continuum from right to left, saying, well, this is smaller than that, but bigger than this. And there's a whole, the other technique beyond, besides doing planning poker, is the same kind of thing. It's a silent sizing is what they call it here, where you develop a continuum. And the idea is just to get, it's really trying to try and get some sort of agreement amongst your team as to the feeling of, what this is. And this is totally based on your team. It should be, it's the kind of thing that really your team should be able to do and not have to expose to the outside world, because as soon as you expose it to the outside world, they're going to say, well, how many days is that? How many hours does that represent? And that starts to cause problems, because then people start thinking in terms of hours and dollars instead of relative size. We've done retrospectives, story decomposition, and story decomposition is actually really familiar, or really similar to functional decomposition of any sort. Basically, what happens here is that we're taking a bigger chunk, we're taking a bigger item, and we're chunking it down into something that's smaller. So we take an epic and we break it down into stories. We take a story and we break it down into tasks. It's just going from a bigger piece to a smaller piece. Okay. Any thoughts or any discussion on story decomposition? Your experience with story decomp? Do you guys do it? Do you find it effective?
We definitely do it, and I definitely think it's necessary.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
It's the same kind of thing actually in a process mode. You can take a process and you can build a high level process that basically gets you from one end of the world to the other end of the world, and you know sort of the path that you have to travel, but you don't go down into any of the details. And then as you go down into the details, as you're proceeding along the path or as you're looking at the different pieces of the path, you start to go down into the details. I've seen this in terms of architectural kinds of things where if you're building a house, you basically have the foundation, you have, your outside framework, you have your plumbing, you have your electricity, you have some of the architectural niceties, you have your landscaping, and all of that goes together in sort of one line to produce a house. But for each of those things, you could drill into it and say, okay, now I want to pull the heating system apart and say, okay, what are the components of the heating system that I have to deal with? I'm basically decomposing that high level heating system down into its components, and that allows me to kind of focus on it. I can say when I'm looking at the heating system, these are the things that I have to look at, and I can drive that all the way down to, if I keep decomposing it, I can drive it all the way down to okay, here's a task I have to order I have to order the appropriate pipe work from the plumbing store, whatever, those kinds of things. So what you're doing is just going from large to small. And you can put these on story maps, so that you have the high level and you keep breaking it down. You break it down to different levels. That doesn't necessarily determine what level you have to be working on for any particular piece of the map. You can be working, you're always going to have to drive down to the lowest level of detail for any particular task that you're working on. But as those things roll up, you may be at the very low level tasks for one feature, and you may be higher up the chain for another feature or for another set of features, so that ultimately you're going to roll it all up, but you don't have to be at the same level at the same time. Story mapping is going to just show you that visual representation of story decomposition. Story decomposition really is about building a story map. So we've got, we have those sort of three levels that I was talking about. This is your process going from left to right. This is your process. For any of these things, you could be operating at, you could have, for instance, this last block over on the right. You could be completely done. If there's only a small amount of things that have to be done at that, you could have that completely done and ready to deliver. Whereas in one of the initial stages, you may be down all the way at the bottom right corner working on a simple task. Ultimately, you have to be able to roll all of this all up, and you need to be able to see where you are. Any more thoughts on story mapping or story decomposition that you want to share, other than that it's useful? It's a pretty decomposition, functional decomposition, this kind of stuff is really pretty common for BAs to have done and to be able to do. The one thing about this is, depending on your overall environment, you may be breaking things down into user stories, so it may be epics to themes to epics to user stories, or it might be components to features down to detail level code modules. The process is kind of the same. It's all about being able to build a picture that says, this is my high level versus my lower level of detail down to my final level of my lowest level of detail. Okay. And the last one here is value stream mapping, which we went over. And on that happy note, we have kind of come to the end of this module. Um, well, and actually, we haven't quite come to the end of this module. We've got the Babok 3 tasks versus techniques. So let me shift over into that. Not sure why I put that there. This is I'm gonna do a quick look at this, so we probably won't go through this because it attaches to every horizon. This is a slide that probably should be at the end of the next module. But basically, one of the things in the Agile extension that we'll look at a little bit more at the delivery horizon is that it takes the Babok knowledge areas and the tasks in the knowledge areas, and it aligns those with the various horizons. It just tells you this is worth taking a look at. There may be a little bit of this on the exam. I would not agonize so much about this. Obviously, for those of you that are CBAPs, you should be more than familiar with the knowledge areas and the tasks, so that you might spend a little bit more time here, and just this might make a little bit more sense to you. For anybody who has not spent time with the Babok, this might be a little less familiar, or this obviously will be a little less familiar. You're still going to want to spend a little bit of time on this, but I don't think that it's a particularly critical area in terms of the exam. So there we are. I'm going to have to make a note to myself to put that in a different module. And we basically looked at the initiative horizon, understanding a little. We explained a little bit about it, went through all of the elements of the horizon, went through how the Agile principles apply to this horizon, and talked about some of the specific techniques that are aligned with the initiative horizon. So I'm thinking that we pretty much covered our objectives there. Again, we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes. It's noon. We're probably going to take another 10-minute break so that we have 50 minutes at least to go through the delivery horizon, get through the delivery horizon. Think about, did we meet any of your expectations with this information? Is this starting to feel holistic to you? Is there anything that you were exposed to that was wildly different than what you were expecting, and therefore changes your expectations? And again, is there anything that you think that you would find immediately applicable to the work that you're doing? Okay. On that happy note, I'm going to shut things off, and it's going to be a 9-minute break, and I'll see you back at 10 minutes after the hour.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
This conference is no longer being recorded.